to Talking with Tech. I'm your host, Rachel Madel, joined as always by Chris Ruge. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Oh, Rachel, I'm great today. How about you?
I'm good. You know why I'm really excited for today's topic is it was a conversation, an internal conversation. You guys are getting insider info with our internal Talking with Tech team, which consists of Michaela, our audio engineer, and Luke, our podcast producer. And I thought there was such a great conversation in there that we decided to talk about on the podcast.
So it all starts out with Luke said that he has a question related to Proloquo for text. And he asked if you think that if a student is using Proloquo for text, or really any text-based AAC, do you still need to model for that particular user? Like, would you have a parent kind of write out the directions for the AAC use on a device? Would the parents and family members and communication partners be using that AAC system as well? Or would they still be speaking sort of verbally or speaking? I don't know. That was the first part of that question. What are your thoughts, Rachel?
Well, so I have a lot to say about this. I have a lot to say because I think this is actually a really good question. Luke had also asked, is a text-based system good for this student, which we can talk about in a second. As far as modeling, yes. If we are working on building language skills with an AAC user, it doesn't matter if they're typing or if they're using, a grid-based system with icons and symbols, we need to model language. And, with a user who's typing, I might do more recasting with that student. It just depends on what the activity is and, what I'm working on, and most importantly, what are the language skills, right? So typically AAC users who are using a typing system, they have a little bit further progressed language skills. Otherwise, I would probably not recommend a typing-based system, which again, we can kind of go into the details about that too, because I think that's an interesting discussion. But we need to model language in a visual way for an AAC user. And that could be you have your own system or, with some students who are primarily typing, I might even, I've used a word processor, I've opened Google Docs and just modeled. It doesn't have to be necessarily on the system depending on the user, but I definitely think that you need to show visually, a visual representation of the language, even if that's just the orthography.
So I would totally agree with that, right? I would totally in line. I want to ask you just a quick follow-up question. You used a word there. What is a recast? Can you define that for everybody?
Oh, yes. So taking what the AAC user said or a student says and, recasting it back. So oftentimes there's a grammatical error or a word missing. And so I'll kind of, recast that back and change whatever it was. So maybe there was, it was eat and it should have been the past tense because we're talking about what we did yesterday. So I'll say, oh, you ate a hamburger. And, I'll say it like that verbally. But I'll also type it out, right? To show you said eat hamburger, but we're talking about what happened yesterday. So you ate a hamburger.
So Rachel, Luke goes on to explain, and I think this is sort of a common thing I've heard over the years, that in this particular dynamic of the student and the child and the adult, the child often can make their wants and needs known without using the AAC, meaning it's gestures, even if it's some sort of speech, but the speech is not really intelligible, but it's intelligible to the parents. And so that's one of the barriers to the implementation of the tool is because, we kind of know what the student is saying. So what are some ideas you have to help? Because that might be true, but then as soon as the student is with somebody who does not understand what they're saying, they're at a disadvantage. So it's what can we do to kind of promote learning how to use that AAC tool, even in situations where you don't necessarily need it right now? It'll be delayed gratification. You'll need it later on down the line. So we're going to practice it now when you're comfortable so that when you're in a situation where you need it, you'll have learned those skills.
And this is kind of a tough question, but I think one of the biggest things you need to do with an AAC user who's using verbal speech that's not understood is teach what does a communication breakdown look like, right? Your message is not being received, which is hard because sometimes kids will say the same thing in the same way and it's just as intelligible the first time as it is the 10th time. And so it's not necessarily an easy skill, but I do exaggerated facial expressions huh? and just like make it very visible that like I do not understand. And so I think that that's part of it, is like, what does a communication breakdown look like? And then teaching, when I have a breakdown in communication, that I then can clarify using this thing. And so I think you can do that systematically by, showing those kind of exaggerated facial expressions and pausing. I think you also can follow up, oh, I think you're trying to say, and then model what you think they're trying to say. If you know what they're trying to say, sometimes you don't. And so I think that's a huge piece of when you're working with a child with verbal speech that's really hard to understand, teaching that this is a way you can, say something so that it's universally understood. And sometimes students have to learn that skill and they're only using the device to clarify, but then the moment they start getting more skills with that device, they start using it more, systematically and regularly. But some of my students, like I work with some students with severe apraxia of speech, and they're only using it when the message breaks down, but the message breaks down a lot. But they're always saying something verbally, and then they're going to the device. And so I think that's okay. But I think that using it to augment communication, there's a kind of strategic ways that you can teach about, I'm not understanding your message right now. Here's what you do when I don't understand your message.
And one of those strategic ways that you just mentioned is by recasting again, or responding, just even responding by using the AAC tool. So that, like you said, that exaggerated, and then bring out the tool yourself and say, not sure, say slower, whatever, would be as an indicator that the communication didn't work, right? But you've responded by using the tool, indicating like, it's cool to use this tool. It's totally fine. This is how we improve our communication.
Yes. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is with a peer. So, and oftentimes peers don't understand. So us as adults, and especially speech language pathologists, I'm like, my ear is trained to understand unintelligible speech. Parents become very good at understanding unintelligible speech. But peers, they're like, what? And oftentimes it's hard because they'll just walk away. They'll be like, don't understand what you're saying, and I'm moving on. So if you have a peer that can model, right? And then you're right next to the student, like, oh, Peter didn't understand what you were saying. Let's show him, let's find the words on here so he can understand. And then all of a sudden there's that peer acceptance, like the peer understood what I said. The peer's like, wow, like, cool, this device helped us. And so I think you're doing a lot of really great things in a moment like that. But peers can be really, really powerful in situations where you're trying to teach that your message is not being understood.
That makes a lot of sense. I could also envision, because I know this is a strategy I have used in the past, where it is, I did understand, but I got most of it. I really was able to piece it together. But even though I'm pretty sure, maybe I just need to be 100% sure, like sort of pretend I don't understand. Pretend's not the right word, but you know what I mean? Like, I need to clarify for sure that I got it right. So, in which case then bring out the device and say, did you mean, and insert whatever the phrase might be, just to make sure that I am understanding completely, even though I might have thought it,
Totally. And this brings up a really important point too, Chris, which is we have to be really selective when we're doing this, because if all of a sudden we decide every time a child opens their mouth, they need to clarify on their AAC system, like think about how frustrating that would be. And so I tell, families and teams, only do this when it's super, super motivating and the child's really eager to communicate a message. It doesn't have to be every single time their speech is, unintelligible. What we can do always is, oh, I think what you're saying is, you want to go outside, and we can model without expectation that the child actually says anything back to us, as a way to reinforce what they said and show them through modeling on the AAC system. So we don't want to do this all the time, because think about how frustrating that would be. Every time you said something verbally and then it was like, didn't understand you, tell me on your device, right? Like that's just super, super frustrating. So we have to kind of pick and choose when we do this. I think we can be strategic about when we're choosing to do it. And I think the level of motivation is an indicator as to when you should do it. Because if a child's really motivated and eager, that's the moment where they're more, inclined to repair a communication breakdown.
Yeah, if you understood what the student said, definitely don't say, tell me on your device, right? Your point is well taken. Be very selective if you think you've got it, go ahead with it. But if you don't, then that's when you could bring out the device and say, did you mean, right? I thought I heard this, that sort of strategy, right? So it's, again, they're asking for clarification, but not like demanding that repeat what they just did on a device.
And I think this is especially hard for parents because parents are masters at understanding the most unintelligible speech, right? I'm like working with a family and they're like, oh, he just said that, he wants more cookies. So I was like, wow, I would have never known that. And so I think it's especially important for parents because sometimes parents do have to either just pause, because that can sometimes be enough to indicate like, go to my device to clarify. But sometimes parents do have to be like, I didn't understand. Because sometimes parents are really good at understanding everything, even if it's super unintelligible. So it just has to be a balancing act. We're not trying to frustrate students, but we are trying to teach them to communicate in a way that's universally understood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have one more thing. I kind of want to circle back to Luke's question because I get this a lot. And this actually was really common in my course, AAC Ally, which is all about assessment for AAC. And it's what do you do when a child or a student is typing primarily for communication? So they have literacy skills and they're typing even when they're on a grid-based system. How do we decide when a typing-only system is a good idea? And Luke, I think, was kind of referencing this when he asked the question. So the first question I asked was, what's the child's MLU spontaneously? So what is the child saying completely on their own through typing? And, what does that look like? Is it single words? Is it 5 words? Are they using grammatical markers? Like, I want to know more about the language skills. I have a student right now in my caseload who he types everything and he's on a grid-based system and he's constantly going to his keyboard. And so we ended up making the switch to touch chat with word power because there's a vocabulary set on there that has a keyboard embedded into the home screen. There's a lot of great word prediction with that system too. I don't want to transition that student primarily to text only or typing only because there's a lot of language development that still needs to happen, a lot of core word usage that I'd like to see. I'd like to still be able to model in a grid-based system with this student, but it's really slowing him down to have to constantly navigate to this, keyboard page. And then all of a sudden we're on a keyboard page and I don't have the ability to model, using symbols. And so I think that, when I'm thinking about text only or typing only, I think that the user has to have a pretty decent language skills if that's the system that I'm going to recommend. Otherwise, like a system like Touch Chat with Word Power, I love that system because it has that keyboard in the middle of the home page. So it's kind of a hybrid, and it's a really great approach where it's like we're not losing time because the keyboard's right there, but I also have all of these icons around it so that I can model language and expand and do all the things that I would do with that student.
That's an excellent question. What is the MLU and what does the expressive language look like? Because that could be one of the items that you'd be thinking about when you're thinking about if you should be changing the tool or what your initial selection might be in the first place. And what are some of the consistent errors a student might be making? Because depending on the system might help you teach, like, this is where ing is, this is where ed is. These are how you formulate words. And because AAC is so visual usually, then you can use that as a tool to teach those grammatical markers. Yeah, and it's depending on the system, it looks differently, but I think that those are really important skills. And if I'm not seeing some of those morphological changes and those things in a spontaneous speech, then I'm less likely to recommend text-based system just because it's easier to model. And I oftentimes have a lot of students who, they are thinking through the lens of typing, and that's super helpful, but I also need to expand their utterances with the core words that they're using and, some of those grammatical changes too. So it's a tough one though. It's a tricky one. And I also think typing is really great for fringe vocabulary. Like, I love when my kids are using kind of a hybrid approach and they're using core on their homepage, and then all of a sudden, instead of trying to find where unicorn is, they're typing it. That's how I would use an AAC system. If all of a sudden I woke up and I wasn't able to communicate verbally, I would probably be using some type of hybrid approach like that, just because sometimes it takes a lot of folder searching to figure out fringe vocabulary. So a symbol-based system would offer core vocabulary is going to be, in the long run, a faster way to get to core vocabulary than typing out every single core vocabulary word. Yet, you can't get to every fringe vocabulary word on most AAC systems without accessing a keyboard. So that hybrid approach is really what you need. And what sometimes happens is that a student who becomes proficient on the keyboard says, I don't need the symbols anymore, or I don't need them at all. That slows me down, which if I knew the keyboard, I can type out my core vocabulary words a lot faster. But that's in the short term. In the long term, if I got better at using the symbol-based system for my core vocabulary, that's actually the much faster way to go, which is why you'd want that hybrid approach.
Yes, I completely agree. And also, I think when we're talking about this, we're probably talking about students who are a little bit older. And so I think it's important to ask, right? Like, what do you like? Let's talk about it. Assuming, that, the language level is there and the language skills are there, I think that we need to talk to AAC users about what they prefer. And sometimes it takes trial and error of certain things and systems and approaches to figure out what makes the most sense.
Absolutely. Same thing for other pieces of technology out there. You try things on, you see what works for you, and get feedback and not just impose it on somebody. So it makes a lot of sense.
I love it. All right, Chris, we're about to head into part 2 with Anya Ashouri. Last week we did we released the first part of our coaching call with her. This week is part 2. So I'm really excited to share the second half of the coaching call we did with Anya Ashouri. Are you enjoying this episode? We would love for you to take a few minutes to hit the subscribe button so you always know when we release new content. Even better, if you leave us a review on iTunes, then more people will find this podcast and learn about AAC. We also love reading your reviews on air. Thank you so much for your support. We love this community. Now we can head back into the episode.
Anya, you actually had mentioned that because there's a framework for that, thinking in that, and that is the MTSS framework, so a multi-tiered system of support. And you had mentioned that, in the at the beginning of our conversation here, you were saying, okay, what supports are tier 1 supports that are available for everybody? What are tier 2 supports that are available for groups of students? And then what are tier 3 supports for students that are very individualized for the students? And so let's get into that for a little bit. What supports do you have available that are at tier 1? They're available to everybody.
Well, our students use Chromebooks, so we have a lot of different extensions and all, text to speech, speech to text. I worked with our IT guy to get Google Read and Write. We have Immersive Reader. And then, if we're going low tech, we got a lot of visual supports. We use Lesson Picks and, all that. And I have some new apps from the different AAC providers. So like Touch Chat and LAMP, Words for Life. And so I printed those like some low tech stuff out for students in the classroom. So those are sort of like for accessible for all. I don't know if there's anything that I am
Let me stretch you here a little bit.
Be on my list. Yeah.
So what you just mentioned there are a bunch of tools, which is an awesome start. Let's think about it from this framework or from this lens. What strategies are tier 1 strategies? So when I say the word resources, what I really mean is tools and strategies put together equal resources. So what are some things that would be those functions of those technologies that are available to everybody? So I'll give you an example because I know that, an example would be, do you have something that reads text aloud? Because there's probably students that need to hear the text that they're listening to. So you said Immersive Reader, right? Immersive Reader is one tool that does that. You had said Chromebooks. Chromebooks is one tool that does that. But the function, what's really important, and the strategy that we're working in is having text being read out loud, so that the strategy is called really something called dual coding. I've got one modality of the text and a second modality of the audio coming at me, and that gives me a better chance to understand the material. So is there other things like that you can think of? Yeah, you know what? In our school, we always talk about this strategy. We always want, I don't know, I'll leave it there. What's something that comes to mind?
We talk about word banks for writing. So I think that could be, that's definitely something that you could write on the whiteboard, or I know that there's digital word banks for writing. There's speech to text, Chrome, but so that is so maybe someone has difficulty, or the strategy would be helping them generate sentences to describe events or pictures or videos, stories. So that would be a strategy, right?
Absolutely.
I guess I'm kind of stuck on the strategy. I think I need to do more work on the strategy in the strategy department.
Well, I'll tell you one that works really well for us. That is pretty pervasive, and it touches so many students. And that is the concept of modeling, right? And when it comes to AAC, we think of it as maybe a tier 2 support, because does everybody need modeling? But who doesn't? Yeah. Who's it not? Who's it going to hurt? Why wouldn't it be a tier 1 support? And if that's the case, and that could be a tier 1 support, then how might that influence your training?
My training with staff, or do you mind reframing that?
Sure. So let's say you have a bunch of students that are going to be now using low-tech AAC because you have printed off LampWords for Life and Touch Chat, and you have some sort of low-tech system there. How do you know that it'll be used? You had mentioned that earlier. So what would you do to help them use that tool?
I would be modeling it, modeling how to model, also in the therapy room too, I could video us and share with the classroom, hey, and I've actually was doing that when we were distance too, is showing them a strategy that I was using. And then I kind of shared it with the class. So that's an idea. I don't know. Am I missing anything?
No, I guess what I'm getting at is your training is focused around the strategy of modeling more than necessarily teaching LAMP or Touch Chat,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And once you've got that, okay, we taught this strategy of modeling. What's the next strategy? Is it using, what's the next biggest pain point? Is it using graphic organizers and making things visual for kids? How can we make things even more visual? That's a strategy, visual tools, or visualizations. It becomes kind of the next thing is just keeping the idea of what's the strategy we want to focus on next that's going to help the most students.
Because tools change, right? And apps change and all that. And technology fails us sometimes.
And the strategy is it's the meat, right?
Yeah.
It's what we need to remember. The tool is there's lots of tools that do lots of things and a lot of the overlap, but it's the strategy that we need people to understand. And that's actually what makes a big difference. To that point, we've talked a lot about the strategies or potential strategies. What do you think is the one that's going to make the biggest difference? So we have a million things we could teach, right? We could be yes, we want word banks. Yes, we want graphic organizers. Yes, speech to text. Also text to speech. We want all the things, right? But we can't do all the things all at once. So what do you think, if we're prioritizing these things, what do you think is the most important to really make a difference for most of the students in these classrooms?
I'm kind of separating the classrooms, because when I think about our students that have more significant language and communication challenges, I think modeling is going to be the biggest, modeling and just visuals. I was in the classroom earlier today, and there isn't a lot of visuals. And so that's definitely something that we need to implement, because with that, you can obviously, you model so much, or, you having the communication boards on their desk where I could be in there showing the staff and they're hearing it, how we're modeling it, and focusing on maybe, something to model that week. When I'm thinking about the other classrooms, those students don't have as much of the language deficits, more of just like a lot of learning. And I know a lot of it is like processing of language and executive functioning. Those classrooms, honestly, one of the biggest barriers is writing. Like 80% of our kids are opting out or shutting down, or there's something around their writing process. So I think what could create the biggest change would be, I think, something like providing word banks, or, having something that's accessible. So it's like, oh yeah, that's how I could start a sentence. Or maybe having, I heard about this once and we need to use this more, is giving an example of like what an expected essay would be. That's a model of exactly what you should be doing. And that actually helped me in grad school. I was like, oh, that's a really good paper. Like, I'm going to write mine similar, you kind of get the gist of it when you're reading something. So providing examples, I think, of writing assignments that are, follow the rubric to kids would also be really beneficial.
Since you mentioned writing, let's talk about that for a little bit. Why do you write? What's the last thing you wrote?
I probably wrote a text message about groceries.
You had some sort of reason to write, right? You sent the text message to someone you care about to remind them that this is the stuff they have to pick up, right?
Yeah.
So often in school, that is artificial. You're writing because I'm the teacher and I told you to do it, as opposed to writing for some sort of authentic purpose. And so I wonder what sort of authentic purposes we could come up with for the students to write about stuff that actually makes a difference to them. Would that eliminate some of those behaviors or decrease them? Mitigate
or
moments of angst.
Yeah, I think so, because if you find something meaningful, you're more engaged, right? And if it pertains to you, incorporates more engagement, and I think there'll be less behavior. So maybe like emails, like sending an email, like writing parents about what you did today, or a friend, or I also think it'd be really fun to like partner with another school, or like, something like some outside of our walls. Like there's a whole nother world out there, guys, and like connecting with those people and those students and seeing what they're up to in different parts of the country or world would be really cool and different.
Influencing people is super important for students, for all students. I mean, and that means making some sort of difference, either solving a problem or giving your opinion, and someone then listened to your opinion and it influenced their opinion. I mean, can you imagine if there was some sort of movement for 5 minutes more of recess, or something like that, and that we're writing a campaign and we're sending it to the principal, and the principal's reading it, and the principal says, "You changed my mind. We're getting 5 more minutes of recess." Oh my goodness, how more powerful. Or something that really, really resonates with the individual.
That's true.
Something they're really passionate about. Maybe it's a specific cartoon character. Maybe it's a TV show they watch. Maybe it's something that's happening with their family, but something that's important to them, I think, makes a lot of difference.
That's a good idea.
I have a follow-up question, because we have a lot of good ideas flowing.
Yeah.
What's currently happening in the classroom with writing? I mean, I know it's probably different in every classroom, but like, is there autonomy with what kids are able to write? Is there flexibility, or is it pretty set and standard?
There is some autonomy. It's sort of on the spectrum. It's like some teachers are just like, write about whatever, which also poses a problem, because kids with executive function are like, I can't start, and they just shut down, versus when it's too rigid and too like, this is exactly what we're doing, and there's no ability to deviate, there's another problem. So it's like kind of this happy medium of like, here are some ideas. A lot of times, it's free flowing, and they just have their Chromebook. and that's it. And
so if you could think about the experience that most students have, I realize there's outliers, right? Like not every kid is not choosing to do their writing assignment for the same reason. But what would you say is, if you could guess what kids are responding to or rejecting or resisting with the writing process, like what would you say is at play if you could guess?
In the writing process, definitely editing is really hard. They're like done and they don't want to go back to it. And a lot of times it's getting started. It's the outlining it, or just creating like sticky notes about like your ideas and forming ideas, right? And a lot of, I work with some high schoolers and we just work on the brainstorming piece. It's like, and because they're just used to getting and starting to type, and then they get stuck and ideas don't flow. And it's like, well, we haven't, so a lot of times I'm like, it's not our goal, but let's make it part of our goal today, is just let's back up a little bit, because this is a huge piece before we even write, before authors or anybody is a writer, we're thinking about ideas, So like brainstorming, I think, is tricky. And I'm not sure if it's explicitly taught.
Yeah. I mean, that's been my experience, is that like, no, it's not being explicitly taught. Like these strategies are the things that really help kids learn. All kids benefit from these strategies. It just so happens the kids that we work with, the kids with severe executive functioning, challenges, they need it. They need it in order to be successful. Other kids learn it kind of on the fly, or they figure out what works for them, or, and so I think that you're right. Like, executive functioning in general is where a lot of kids fall through the cracks, because they're not able to learn how to brainstorm or, start a task. So thinking kind of through this lens, this is really good. I feel like we're really getting to the bottom of like, okay, here are the problems. Here is like potentially what's at play here for when students are saying like, no, I can't do this, or not having success with the writing process. What's the strategy that you think could really move the needle for most kids? Again, like we have to talk in generalities because we're thinking about classrooms, not just specific students, but what's the strategy that you think will really help?
I think teaching brainstorming, how to do it. We could do it with like sticky notes on the classroom whiteboard. We could do, I know that there's different Poplet or like different, apps for that. We could do a Jamboard with, digital sticky notes, maybe do like a class brainstorm, like all together, and just really coaching and modeling my thoughts. Like, I think a lot of times in working with this population for long, there's not a lot of, I shouldn't say not a lot. I ask them, I'm like, do you guys have like these thoughts? Like, do you guys have like a little voice inside your head that like kind of, and they're like, not so much. I'm like, so we kind of have to teach the thinking, the thought processes, right? And sort of modeling that, like, I'm wondering, about like, if we could extend recess 5 more minutes, I'm wondering how we would do that. And sort of like this coaching of language that they need to hear that is maybe turned down a little bit or silent. And, because that really gets the process going, is we have these internal thoughts and dialogue that isn't always, allowed. So I think like that would be a good strategy and like a great jumping off place, because from after brainstorming, it's like, great, we've got all this. Let's take a picture with an iPad or whatever. We have this now. Like, let's start the process. Let's put this in a graphic organizer, right?
I think that. Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, I was going to say, see how the strategy, the tool follows the strategy. Yeah, now you're like, totally. Oh, here's how we're actually going to do it. Like, but the strategy is like the most important thing.
Yeah.
And I think that, we're talking about brainstorming and we're talking about all of these really great skills. You also mentioned this idea of a think aloud, right? Like, how do we teach kids that internal process, how I'm actually thinking about things? I think that's an awesome strategy to teach for multiple things. Like, for across the board, I feel like if you're working with AAC users with limited language, like think alouds are really helpful to help them learn their system. And so I think that that's a great strategy too. But I think that, we're really kind of prioritizing here, like what do we think is actually going to move the needle? And then once we have that strategy and we have that process and that we do all the, support with the teachers and all those things, then it's like, okay, what's the next strategy? You know, so like I feel like we're breaking this down in like a systematic way, which hopefully is helpful. I'm feeling inspired. I'm like,
do you want to come?
I do.
We're brainstorming. Oh my goodness.
So Anya, I think another way to help think about, well, what's our next strategy is you have a little bit of a roadmap there in the IEPs that you've been writing, right? If you look at the accommodations, that is a little trick that helps, is that over the last 15 to 20 years of assistive technology and education in general, we see this trend that the tier 3 supports eventually become a tier 1 support. So stuff that started off for students with disabilities eventually comes back around and it flows in this direction. People can't see me, only Anya can see me and Rachel drawing my finger down the triangle that I'm picturing in my mind that goes from tier 3 to tier 1. So tier 3 is often accommodations. Like, these are specific things that students need to guarantee a free, appropriate public education, or in case private education. Same idea. So are there accommodations you could see across the board? You know what? In our school, everybody has this accommodation. And if that's the case, if you did an analysis of what accommodations are most prevalent in your district, you could say, let's move those from accommodations that are a tier 3 thing to, this is just how we do it. You know, now we teach using this thing, and that becomes our next strategy. What do you think about that?
I love that. And I think one example too is, you know, having more visual supports like outside during free play, you know, like having like a big, oh my gosh, you guys, I'm having word finding issues today.
Okay.
having like a low tech we need more visuals. Having like a low tech communication board out, you know, all over the school for everybody, because there's kids that are still struggling, you know, formulating thoughts or word finding issues like me, where they see it and they're like, oh yeah, you know, we could model a lot of like behaviors on here. Cause a lot of times it's triggering to hear an adult redirect, you know, versus like just pointing to something that is visual. It's not as, you know, annoying when, you know, hearing people nag or redirect you and just pointing to visuals. So that's something I was thinking would be amazing.
Anya, that sounds like an authentic problem that students could help you solve. I mean, imagine you printing out a bunch of that stuff or asking them to help you do that and then saying, where do we put these, everybody? And you're going around putting them, they would put them strategically where they think they've been used, as opposed to one more thing you need to do, one more thing you got to get permission to do. Do you know what I mean? Spending lots of money on a giant board that's in one spot on the playground, do you know, which is fine. Do that too if you can, you know what I mean? But you don't have to wait for that, and you don't have to do months of work necessarily when you can get the students to help you do that. And now they're critically thinking, they're solving problems, they're part of the solution. They come away from the school day empowered, you know?
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I get some help.
Awesome. Okay. I want to just put all the pieces together here. So we've been having a lot of conversations, and I feel like this is the way I see it. And I would love to know your thoughts, but it feels like one of the important pieces that we kind of distinguished is that different classrooms need different things. So thinking through that lens, it feels like we don't have one meeting with everybody, right? Because we're talking about different things theoretically. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, let's differentiate a little bit for the classrooms.
Yes. And then if we're thinking about you mentioned a few times, like one of the barriers is time, which I feel like we can all relate to. Like nobody has enough time, and like getting people organized in a meeting is already hard. So like, what are you envisioning for like the actual like implementation of this? Like we talked about a lot of the kind of discrete things that are the puzzle pieces. Like, how do we put all the puzzle pieces together? I'm curious, like going away from this call, like how are you going to organize yourself to like figure out something that's strategic and systematic?
Oh, wow. That's such a good question. I think I'm thinking about sort of the short-term, long-term goals. I think something that I can start doing sort of immediately is sharing about the SET framework. And when we're talking and the importance of it. And also, I think that would be a good time to also maybe when we're talking about behaviorally challenged kids, it's like, all right, well, let's talk about it with the SET framework. And maybe that could be our guide to seeing what kind of strategies we need to put in place in what environment. And gosh, and then I think also creating sort of like a library of tools for staff to go to be able to, retrieve that previously learned information. What else?
Can we talk about that library for a second?
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more of your vision about that?
Well, I would like to create videos and just having a place where people can access it easily. So
gotcha, like a video library.
Yeah, sorry, a video library.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about a strategy of brainstorming. We could talk about it in a clinical or with students, and then that could be in the library of like, if there's a new teacher that's getting on board, it's like, hey, this is a strategy that we use, So like, I'm thinking of like what strategy and like, how do we get it implemented and how do we save it so that we can access it? So I think in like threefold. But it's easy to get overwhelmed. So it's like, I can't move mountains today, but like what small change can I begin with? And, it's like, we're approaching the end of the year and,
Yep.
Well, I feel like you have a really great plan. You have a lot of good ideas. And I feel like we did narrow it down. So like, what are your takeaways from like this whole talk? Like, what are some, like, I always like to think really small. Like, what is the one or two things that you're going to do that's going to like right off the bat make a difference?
I think my big takeaway is really focusing on strategies for teaching and implementation and less about the tools, because I think we do get caught up in like, oh, there's this new tool and this shiny fancy tool, and the tool goes away or we don't have funding for the tool. And so behind the tool is the strategy. So like, let's talk about the strategy is going to be lasting. And actually this, like just thinking out loud, a strategy like tool, there could be a myriad of tools for a strategy. Like you can use a bunch of different tools. It doesn't have to be, for brainstorming, it doesn't have to be Poplet. Like it could be sticky notes. It could be, digital. It could be so many different things. Right. So I think that was my big takeaway, is really focusing on strategies and empowering staff to going in the classroom. I think that was, what was mentioned before, Chris, is going in the classroom at least 5 to 6 times, observing, kind of showing how maybe we could use a strategy, and then empowering the staff in the classroom to be able to use that and carry on.
Yeah, I totally see that as you had laid out kind of a step of where you want that library to go. And that to me is the next step. So when you think, Rachel said, take little steps, but plan down the road, I could totally see that library, and then people experience stuff in that library, and then they need your support for them to learn the skill, because now they have the idea, they know the background knowledge, they just need some feedback and need some coaching from someone like you to come in for a number of sessions to give them feedback on learning, making sure that skill actually translates.
Absolutely. And I think creating a library makes it more accessible, because, when you work in a school, there's a range of different learners, adults that we work with. Right. And so like having something that's a video, they get their closed captioning, they can watch it on a slower speed, they can rewind it. Right. And, they can process it more times and differently. So I think that is a great accommodation / resource. Yeah. That's been really helpful, you guys.
Of course. I mean, I think that you have like a really good like framework, and I love that you're thinking long term. I love that you're trying to automate some of the process. And so like I envision you like starting small with one of the strategies, either modeling or brainstorming, and creating some type of video or some type of learning experience around that strategy. And then like Chris said, like going in and helping teachers with the implementation. What would be even better is like having that process recorded. Walking into a classroom, doing a collaborative brainstorm with a teacher, and then showing that to other teachers as a way to be like, this is us actually doing it though. And so I think that if you start thinking through that lens, then you're able to make, we're talking about big changes here, like lots of time to train all these people. Like, how are we going to do it? And I feel really good about kind of everything we talked about. And I think we just need to start small. And like anything else, as you start going through the process, you're going to refine the process. Like, actually, it doesn't make sense to do it this way. Maybe we need to do this first, and then we'll do this. But I think you have a really good framework. And most importantly, you're thinking about all the things that are really important, which is like, what's the most important strategy to start with? How do I create buy-in with the situation? How do I figure out how to teach, on a larger scale to make a greater impact? So all of those things will guide you, and the details will kind of figure themselves out as you start just like forging ahead.
Yeah. And I created a Wakelet too, just like I have all my resources. I have so much like stuff in Google Keep, but I've been really loving Wakelet, and I created one for parents for like resources for AAC and like modeling and wait time and all that. So parents can access like whatever stage that we're at with videos. And then I also have one for assistive tech for kids transitioning. And of course, I was able to use a lot of the resources you sent for executive functioning. Like what do students in high school, middle school need to transition? So Wakelet's actually been a great vehicle to like gather and curate videos and information for people.
Awesome. Is that Wakelet something that is available to the public, or do you keep it private?
No, I keep it public. Yeah.
Awesome. Why not share it with the world, right?
Right. Yeah.
So would you mind sending it to us, and we'll put it in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. Fantastic.
Anya, are there any like burning questions that you're like, they still didn't help me with this thing or this question?
No, I feel like it was really helpful and informative, and it was like great to get both your perspectives. And like sometimes like I have all these thoughts, and it's nice to have like an outside lens to look in and be like, okay, here's what, let's focus. And so that was really helpful in like focusing and creating like an action plan. So it's measurable and it's attainable and achievable.
Yep. I mean, you had
goals.
you had almost all the answers already, Anya. So like we just helped put the pieces together for you, which is part of the coaching process, right? Like it's asking strategic questions to help you like really prioritize and organize and all these ideas that were swirling around. Hardly ever, Chris, I don't know that we've ever had a coaching call where like we had to do so much teaching. It's always like you guys are listeners of the podcast. You're like, you already know like a lot about AAC or assistive technology. It's really just us like guiding your thought process and almost giving like permission, like, yeah, that was the right thing. You're on the right track. The encouragement, right?
It's so true. Yeah. Sometimes you feel like, there's much more of a community, but a lot of times you feel like an island, and sometimes you're not speaking the same language with everyone. You're like, I need people who speak my language real quick to like, tell me about these thoughts and ideas I have. So that was really great. Yeah. It's nice to connect.
You participate in AT chat, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I could tell when you said, educational malpractice. I was like, that's Karen.
That's Karen.
Right there.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, that's a strong word, but
yeah. No, but it shows how much work you've put into it. And I think that's inspiring for other people that will listen to this podcast and go, yeah, we're all in this journey together. And so you're setting a model there for what professional learning looks like. And so thank you for that. Yeah,
thank you. And thank you both. I wouldn't be here I know it sounds so cheesy and cliche, but really like you guys kind of were the catalyst for like, oh my God. And other passionate people that are forging ahead helps us to be like, okay, I can get there. And then hopefully someday I can do the same for others, let's shake things up.
Totally.
Amazing. Anya, we were so thankful that you reached out, and this was an awesome conversation. Thank you for letting us record this and share it with all of our listeners, because I know that they're going to benefit too. And you are not alone in feeling like overwhelmed and like there's so much to know and learn, not sure which direction to go. But like Chris said, you're seeking out the information and the knowledge, and your school is very lucky to have you a part of their team and to support all the students. You can tell you're really passionate about what you do, which is something that can't be taught and something that really drives us, because our work isn't always easy. But having that passion inside of you to help and to do the best you can is really important. So I commend you for that, and really excited to share this with the world. So thank you for coming on, Anya, for Talking with Tech. I'm Rachel Mado, joined by Chris Bouguet, Anya Ashouri. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will talk to you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye, Anya.
Bye. Thanks.
Stay in touch.